what's our primary forage species in this part of Georgia? Bermuda grass, Bahia grass in South Georgia, fescue. Now, unfortunately, those are all kind of low at the bottom. You know, Bahia grass wasn't here because the Bahia grass won't grow in eastern Kentucky, but I can just about tell you that the Bahia grass is going to be way down here. You know, Johnson grass is a good example of one that is actually just about as good as sorghum Sudan. Okay? So that is one that's highly preferred. Now, just like kudzu, though, you start grazing it very much, you're not going to have it. Yeah, it's actually one that is very grazing intolerant. But we do have some on this list that will grow here and that we can exploit and employ in different areas. And as we go through, I'm going to spend some more time talking about some of the highlights of that list. Okay. Now, just because we're most familiar with Bermuda grass, and I'm going to start from there, talk about some of the key forage species, because just because they're not preferred does not necessarily mean that we can't use them. Those animals will still go out there and graze that material. Okay? It may not be what they really want to do. But you know, you might have heard that old story about the guy that had bird dogs, and he was selling somebody a bird dog, and the guy that he was buying it, that was buying those dogs, said something to the effect that he couldn't get his dogs to eat all that turnip greens and whatnot that he was trying to feed his dogs. He said basically the fact that if you don't give them anything else to eat for about 6 or 8 weeks, they'll decide that they like turnip greens. So basically the same applies here. We do need to still use that because that is our most cost-effective forage species. But it's not the only thing that we can use. And we can sprinkle in a little bit of other activity here with some of these other species to really fill in the gaps. Okay, Bermuda grass. I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on these different ones, but I just want to go through and hit the highlights. There are differences between common, which are typically seeded varieties of Bermuda grass, and hybrids, the sprig types of Bermuda grass. Both in terms of quality, our sprig or hybrid types typically are going to be higher in quality, but they're especially going to be higher in yield. Our hybrids usually are about 50 to 60% higher in yield than the common or seeded type of Bermudas. Usually very drought tolerant, but they do require a lot of fertility. Now, varieties do differ in how high in quality they are. You're just going to kind of gloss through these because this information is provided in this publication entitled Selecting a Forage Bermuda Grass Variety. Good information about selecting a particular variety for your farm operation if you're starting new. Now, if you're like most folks, you've got what you've got, and you're going to try to make the best out of that. So we're going to work through making the best out of that. Bahia grass is another common option, particularly as you get further south from here. Bahia grass is one that I really like from the standpoint of its tolerance to a lot of conditions. Very tolerant to some low soil pHs, fertility, very tolerant of close grazing, and it's very resistant to a lot of diseases and pest problems. Now, the other nice thing about it is extremely competitive, but the bad thing about it is extremely competitive, right? And especially if we're trying to get some of these other species, and what ordinarily we would talk about as being weeds, but are still desirable species, especially in goat pastures. Now, the other aspect of this, especially if you're starting from new, is these are propagated by seed, and they generally are relatively slow to get started. Although we've improved upon that a little bit. Just want to throw this up here that we have variety trial information on Bermuda grass, Bahia grass, and all of the other species that I'm going to be talking about tonight on our website. And I'll talk more about the website in just a little while. While we're on the subject of the warm season species, particularly because right here tonight we're in the warm season, I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking about sorghum Sudan, pearl millet, and some of those other species, which, oh, by the way, we're very high on the list of palatability for those animals, if you recall that list. These warm season annual grasses were very high on that list. So this is from that same pasture area where those animals were being allowed to graze different forage types. And it was really interesting to go out there and watch them graze sorghum Sudan. Because if you were a cow, the cow would just come along and kind of grab a hold of several different leaves, But the way that the goat does this is it climbs up on top of that, rides it down with its feet, and starts eating backwards. I've never seen an animal eating backwards before, but it was kind of cool to watch them do it. Now, the other thing that they would do is break that off, and they would allow it to pop back up, and then they would chew on whatever they were consuming. Now, the summer annuals include a number of different species, and I don't have time to go into all of them tonight, but primarily we're talking about pearl millet, sorghum Sudan, Sudan grass. Those three are the most important summer annual species, and those all would typically be very highly preferred by goats. Brown top millet, proso millet, dove millet, you name it, there's a bunch of others that go into that category too. Not quite as preferred, but still available, not very productive, and all of them have a lot of nitrate issues. Pearl millet, sorghum Sudan, all of those also can be high nitrates, but not all that, not as bad as some of the other species. Anything in the sorghum family can also have an issue with prussic acid poison. It's a cyanide compound. As a general rule, goats are not as affected by that as maybe other species, mainly because of how they graze this material. They graze it a little bit differently. As I mentioned, from the top, kind of working down. Now, the point I want to make here with any of these summer annuals, and I've been getting a lot of questions right here at the beginning, folks wanting to plant these right now. And you're going to get some really, really low yields if you plant them right now. It's probably not even worth your effort doing this at this point. But if you were to plant that in May or early June, certainly that's a viable option, especially to fill in some of the gaps. Now let's talk a little bit about cool season perennial grasses. And for us in Georgia and really throughout most of the South, the only perennial cool season grass that we talk about or have any use for is actually tall fescue. And tall fescue is the most widely used forage across the whole of the U.S., mainly because it's high yielding and very persistent. Now we are very much on the southern edge of its adaptation zone. So we are going to be losing some stands of tall fescue over time. But as a general rule, it's still going to be a very good and helpful forage for us. Now it does have a downside. Now if you haven't ever heard of this, hopefully maybe you'll spend some more time researching this, but just kind of hitting the highlights. Fescue has a fungus that lives inside of that plant, at least those that are infected with that particular fungus. And that fungus produces these toxic alkaloids that are associated with a broad spectrum of animal disorders called fescue toxicosis. That includes things like losing the tail switch, losing, sloughing off hooves, having poor lactation, having very difficult kidding when they're giving birth to kids. So this is a very serious issue if you have tall fescue in your pastures, and unless you have planted one of the novel endophyte tall fescues, and if you have tall fescue in your pasture, more than likely it is the endophyte infected tall fescue. Now, the degree to which that is affecting you may not be enough to warrant replacement, but I can almost guarantee you that if you've got it out there, you're going to have some kind of symptoms of this. You may never have noticed it. Okay. So there is an important aspect of that, and if you are going through renovations and changing your pastures over, I would definitely recommend looking at what we call the novel endophyte tall fescue. So novel endophyte tall fescues have an endophyte in them, but it's a particular type of endophyte that does not produce those toxins. It gives it all the positive benefits of keeping the fescue there in stand, but it doesn't have all of the negative benefits associated with the fescue toxicosis issues. So I'll just leave it at that, and if you have more questions about that, we can revisit it. Yes, ma'am?
Is there a certain time of the year that fungus would be more of a problem than others?
That's a really good question, because that's exactly right. So to repeat the question, is there a certain time of the year where those toxins, those alkaloids, are more problematic than others? And there certainly is. The biggest problem is in the spring of the year. That typically, especially as we get into late May and June, that becomes really where we have some major issues with those toxins. We can also have those toxins present throughout the entire year, but particularly in the spring of the year, they're going to be highest. In the fall of the year, particularly when we stockpile tall fescue, in other words, allow it to grow up starting about this time of the year, amass some amount of forage out there and avoid grazing it until, say, after Thanksgiving for us, for example. During that time, the toxin levels actually go down and actually can still be used very effectively for animal production systems without having major fescue toxicosis issues. Okay? So if you, for example, are getting ready to kid in January and February, that would be a great time to use tall fescue. If you go back to that one of those first slides where I'm talking about that fall gap, where we don't have a lot of productive forages in the fall, the one nice thing about tall fescue is it's very productive at that particular time of the year, given that if we have rain. If we don't have rain, it don't matter. But if we do get rain, it does matter, and we can get some good forage out of it in the fall of the year. Okay, let me switch gears now and talk a little bit about legumes, because legumes are one of those groups of species that goats really do enjoy consuming. And we'll talk about each of these in turn, but one of the important aspects of this that we kind of, usually this is where we start talking about legumes, is the ability to fix nitrogen from the atmosphere in association with the bacteria that colonize the roots. And you can see that we can produce quite a bit of nitrogen that is also extremely valuable on a per acre basis. And especially these annual clovers, which I really think fit extremely well with our forage systems in general, as well as white clover as a companion, for example, with our tall fescue, that fixes a lot of nitrogen, provides a lot of nitrogen, a lot of value here, a lot per acre.
And Dennis, and while that's great, that really means a good full stand, though.
No, actually, Forrest, in this case, we're talking about in the lower end of the range here would actually be about a 20 to 30% stand.
Is that right?
As we get up into 30 to 40% stand is where we would like to see these legumes. We're going to be on the upper end of this range. That's a good point. Some confusion about how much of a stand do you have to get those ranges. And the upper end here is very possible if we're maintaining it at the 30 to 40% stand level. Okay, but the biggest factor, in my opinion, about legumes is the quality that they're providing. And especially for animals that are very selective about how they're grazing, they're going to selectively pick out the legumes in these pastures. So if we were to look at our Bermuda grasses, low end of the digestibility spectrum, that's primarily why they avoid eating them. That's primarily why they like to eat these legumes, is that they typically are higher in quality. So if we're just trying to maintain an animal, we can do that on pretty much everything. But if we're trying to really get any kind of moderate or even high production out of these animals, we're going to have to focus on using some more legumes, or at the very least, being at the high end of productivity of many of these other species. Okay, so I've already mentioned this, but the legumes really have the possibility of offsetting some of the effects of the toxicosis. They're not going to solve it. They don't even really dilute the problem, okay? But they do help, because of their higher quality, they are going to help boost the animal performance. Now let's take a moment to focus on our winter annual legumes. This particular one happens to be crimson clover, one of my favorite ones, but there are a number of annual clovers that really can work well for us here in the Piedmont. This is some work that was done in Georgia, here in Athens and at Eatonton, and I've split this apart into two different columns. The first one is the yields by the end of March, okay? And then this is the total yields for the rest of the season, or the total altogether, including that was before the 1st of March, or the end of March.